Steps here. There's Don. So, well, we got Don. You all right?
I am now.
For Detroit to be reckoned.
Don King is certainly the most colorful, if not the most successful boxing promoter in the sport today.
Around that attraction so that you can make money for the people that are participating and make some for yourself.
On the evening of April 20th, 1966, a man named Sam Garrett was beaten to death on the sidewalk outside the Manhattan Tap Room on Cedar Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 34 years old. He was smaller than the man beating him, and, by multiple accounts, he was already on the ground and already unconscious when the kicks to his head continued. Two Cleveland police detectives who happened to be driving past the bar stopped their patrol car and witnessed the attack in progress. They saw a large man with a gun in his right hand kicking the prone figure in the face and head. They ordered the man to stop and to drop the weapon. He dropped the gun on the trunk of a nearby car. And then, by the testimony of the detectives at the subsequent trial, he kicked the unconscious man in the face one more time before finally stepping back. Sam Garrett was taken to the hospital with a punctured eardrum, a fractured jaw, and a possible skull fracture. Witnesses at the scene reported that his last words, spoken before he lost consciousness, were, "I'll give you the money, Don." He died 5 days later. The man on the sidewalk that night was Don King. He would serve 3 years and 11 months in state prison. He would be pardoned by the governor of Ohio in 1983. He would go on to promote the Rumble in the Jungle, the Thrilla in Manila, and hundreds of championship fights across 5 decades. He would make himself one of the most recognizable figures in the history of American sports. He would appear at political conventions and in presidential campaigns and on the covers of magazines, draped in American flags, hair electrified into a trademark silhouette that became as instantly identifiable as any athlete he ever promoted. He would also, in the view of many fighters and boxing historians, spend his entire career doing to boxing what he did to Sam Garrett, using superior force, superior cunning, and the willingness to do what other people would not, to extract maximum value from situations that were never quite as equal as they appeared, and to leave the other party with considerably less than they were owed. This is the story of Don King. All of it.
How did you kill a man in a fist fight?
Well, we was fighting one another and we was kicking one another and his head hit the concrete and it must have been a pretty bad blow, which I've suffered deep contrition for.
The Peanut Bags and the Numbers Game. Don King was born in Cleveland, Ohio, on August 20th, 1931, the 5th child of Clarence and Hattie King. His father was a steelworker. When King was 10 years old, Clarence King was killed in an explosion at the steel plant. Hattie took the insurance money and moved her family to a middle-class section of Cleveland, supporting them by selling pies and roasted peanuts. The King children helped with sales. Inside each bag of peanuts, they placed a small slip of paper with a number on it. A miniature lottery embedded in a snack. That was Don King's first experience with the numbers game. He was 10 years old, and he already understood that the product being sold was less important than the action underneath it. He was accepted to Kent State University after high school, a genuine academic opportunity for a young black man in 1950s Ohio. He spent the summer working as a numbers runner for one of Cleveland's illegal lottery operators to raise tuition money. Before he had saved enough, he misplaced a winning betting slip and had to pay the payout out of his own pocket. That ended college. Instead of enrolling at Kent State, he stayed in Cleveland and went into the numbers business for himself. by the time he was 30. Don King was the most successful numbers banker in Cleveland. He had built a system of extraordinary complexity, rigging a popular lottery that drew on stock market results, reducing his own risk to 200-to-1 odds while paying out at 500-to-1. He ran his operation from a bar in one of Cleveland's black neighborhoods while living in a house in the middle-class suburb of Shaker Heights. He was known on the street as Cadillac Slim. He carried a .357 Magnum in his belt. He had a network of runners, a nightclub, and the kind of reputation that in his world was worth more than a business license. In December 1954, when Don King was 23 years old, a man named Hillary Brown attempted to rob one of his gambling houses. King shot him. Brown died. The court ruled justifiable homicide. No charges. The lesson the legal system delivered to Don King in 1954 was that if you were sufficiently provoked, the application of lethal force produced no consequences. He would remember that lesson. 12 years later, on a Beatambud sidewalk in Cleveland, he applied a version of it to Sam Garrett. The 4 years that made him. The jury convicted King of second-degree murder. The judge reduced the charge to non-negligent manslaughter at sentencing. He received an indeterminate sentence of 1 to 15 years and served 3 years and 11 months at the Marion Correctional Institution in Marion, Ohio. He later described his time in prison not as punishment, but as education. "I didn't serve time," he said afterward. "I made time serve me." This was not entirely a performance. Inside Marion, King immersed himself in classic literature and philosophy with a genuine voraciousness. He read Shakespeare and Voltaire and Machiavelli. He studied the construction of rhetoric. He developed the extravagant, Latinate, malapropism-rich vocabulary that would later become his signature, a verbal style that was partly comic, partly deliberate misdirection, and entirely effective at making whoever was listening feel simultaneously amused and slightly off balance. He emerged from prison in 1971 armed, as he put it, and dangerous, not with a weapon, with language, and with 4 years of uninterrupted time to think about what he was going to do with the rest of his life. What he had realized, watching the world of boxing from his Shaker Heights bar and his Cleveland gambling operation, was that the sport was a numbers game of a different kind. Money moved through it in ways that were only partially visible. Fighters were the product, but rarely the beneficiaries. Promoters and managers extracted enormous percentages from purses. Sanctioning bodies made decisions based on relationships rather than merit. The whole apparatus was, in the fundamental sense he had understood since the peanut bags, a system built to benefit the people who controlled the flow of money rather than the people who generated it. He had spent his life inside a different version of that system. He understood it in his bones. He got out of prison and went to work. His entry into boxing promotion came through exactly the kind of audacious personal salesmanship that would define his entire career. He knew Muhammad Ali had connections to Cleveland's black community. He arranged for Ali to participate in a charity boxing exhibition to raise money for a struggling Cleveland hospital, using the fighter's affection for the community to get him in the room and then leveraging that relationship into something bigger. It worked. Ali trusted him. And once Muhammad Ali trusted you, the doors that opened were not ordinary doors.
He was a great guy. He was my friend for life. He was a champion of the people, a fighter for the people.
In 1973, he talked his way into George Foreman's camp immediately after Foreman knocked out Joe Frazier to become heavyweight champion. King had no promotional track record of any significance, no major fights on his resume, and no obvious reason why a new heavyweight champion of the world would choose him over established promoters with decades of experience. He got in anyway. He always got in. Decades later, a podcast documentary about the Rumble in the Jungle described a detail that perfectly illustrated his method. During the negotiations for the fight, King asked Foreman to sign a blank contract, and Foreman signed it. 7 blank sheets of paper. That one detail, the documentarian said, told you everything about the power of persuasion Don King had built. With Ali and Foreman both in his orbit, he organized the fight that made his reputation for the rest of his life. The Rumble in the Jungle.
What was the Rumble in the Jungle like?
Probably the most, we picked the fight to go out of Africa because the government there would pay more, wouldn't take any taxes, just to highlight Mobutu, Seko. He wanted to highlight this great country with all the mineral wealth and show his kingdom there, and he paid us so much money.
October 30th, 1974. In Kinshasa, Zaire, $5 million for each fighter, the most that had ever been guaranteed to any heavyweight in history. He negotiated the money from Mobutu Sese Seko, Zaire's dictator, who saw the fight as a vehicle for international prestige and was willing to fund it with the country's resources. King solved the problem of financing the biggest fight ever, promoted by making a deal with one of the most brutal autocrats in African history, because that was who had the money, and Don King went to where the money was. The fight itself was a masterpiece. Ali's rope-a-dope, Foreman's exhaustion in the 8th round, the knockout, the 80,000 people in the stadium, the billion who watched it globally. It was the greatest sporting event of the century by many measures. And Don King, who had stomped a man to death on a Cleveland sidewalk 8 years earlier, was suddenly standing at the center of it. The following year, he promoted the Thrilla in Manila, Ali versus Frazier III in the Philippines, one of the most brutal and transcendent fights ever contested. Back to back, he had promoted the 2 most significant heavyweight championship bouts in the history of the sport, and Lloyd Price, the legendary rhythm and blues singer, one of the performers who had flown to Zaire to entertain crowds as part of the cultural spectacle surrounding the Rumble in the Jungle, was never paid. Not a dollar. That detail, small as it seems against the backdrop of a billion-dollar event, was the first public data point in a pattern that would characterize the next 50 years of Don King's career. The machine he built. Don King did not steal from fighters the way a pickpocket steals. He built structures. He created systems, elaborate webs of contracts and side agreements and consulting fees and ancillary charges that were individually defensible and collectively devastating to the fighters at the center of them. The mechanics he developed over the years were sophisticated. He inserted clauses into promotional contracts requiring that any fighter who defeated one of his champions had to use King as their promoter for future title defenses, meaning that even a fighter who had beaten his man could not escape him. He cultivated relationships with sanctioning body officials that gave him de facto control over which fighters were eligible for title shots and which were not. In 1978, when Leon Spinks won the WBA and WBC heavyweight titles from Muhammad Ali in a fight promoted by Bob Arum, King's rival, and therefore an outcome that benefited the wrong promoter, King called his friend Jose Sulaiman, president of the World Boxing Council, and persuaded him to strip Spinks of the WBC belt for the technical violation of offering Ali a contractual rematch rather than defending against the #1 contender. The #1 contender was Ken Norton, who happened to be one of King's fighters. Norton won the WBC title in the resulting fight and then lost it in his first defense to Larry Holmes, who was also one of King's fighters. King had stolen a world heavyweight title through a phone call to a sanctioning body official. But the fullest expression of his method was Mike Tyson. King entered Tyson's life in 1986, when the 20-year-old was already being managed by Jimmy Jacobs and Bill Caton. After Jacobs died in 1987, King began working on Tyson's trust. He understood, from years of operating in the same world, what Tyson had and what Tyson lacked. He had extraordinary physical gifts and an earning potential unlike anyone in boxing history. He had grown up in deep poverty in Brooklyn, had almost no formal education, could not read contracts, and had no framework for evaluating the financial agreements he was being asked to sign. He trusted the people he trusted completely and was utterly exposed when that trust was misplaced. King positioned himself as the black promoter who understood Tyson's world in ways that white promoters could not. When Tyson went to prison in 1992 for rape, King visited him regularly and used those visits to get contracts signed in a prison visiting room with no attorney present for Tyson, in conditions that the subsequent lawsuit described as the deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable person with no access to legal counsel. When Tyson came out of prison in 1995, the financial structure King had built around him was already extracting enormous sums. Court documents later showed that King was taking 30% of Tyson's purse as his promotional cut, technically in violation of Nevada boxing regulations, which capped promotional fees. He was also paying a $100,000 per fight consulting fee to his wife, Henrietta King, and $50,000 per fight fees to each of his 2 sons. Tyson was paying for the legal expenses of King's other business disputes. He was paying for King's travel. He was paying for renovations at King's offices. He was paying the gardening bills. In 1996, a man whose entire function at Tyson press conferences was to wear military fatigues and shout guerrilla warfare was paid $300,000 from Tyson's funds. The $30 million Tyson received for each Holyfield fight did not reach him intact. By the time Tyson wrote checks to King and to his 2 co-managers, Rory Holloway and John Horn, who King's own former chief financial officer described in court documents as people who existed primarily as window dressing for King, the $30 million had been reduced by approximately half. What looked from the outside like a $30 million payday was, for Tyson, a $15 million payday from which ongoing expenses, obligations that were actually payments to King and his family continued to flow. In 1998, Tyson sued King for $100 million, alleging fraud and theft across more than a decade. The lawsuit was settled out of court for $14 million, of which a significant portion went to Tyson's creditors rather than to Tyson himself. The full amount of what King extracted from his career was never established in a courtroom. King's former chief financial officer had estimated it at $65 million from Tyson's purses and television and casino deals alone. There were other fighters. There were other decades. Mike Tyson, speaking on a podcast in 2020, said of Don King, "He did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter in boxing history."
I got caught up with this other piece of shit, Don King, who's just a wretched, slimy, reptilian.
None of this happened in secret. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Don King's career. The lawsuits were public. The testimony was on the record. The pattern was visible to anyone who looked at it. And yet, for 50 years, Don King remained one of the most prominent figures in his sport, invited to political conventions, photographed with candidates and presidents, given platforms and tributes and the language of legitimate success. Part of this was simply the performance. Don King is one of the most gifted verbal performers in the history of American public life. The flag-draped suits, the electrified hair, the torrent of Shakespearean misquotation and manufactured gravitas. It is a character constructed with extraordinary care and maintained with ferocious consistency. It draws attention and then holds it. It makes the person watching feel that they are witnessing something so large and so colorful that the details underneath are less important than the spectacle on top. He once said of his critics and the journalists who pursued him, "You love my black ass because I am exciting." If you didn't have Don King, you would have to invent him. He was not entirely wrong. The sport needed someone like him to make events feel like events. The Rumble in the Jungle required a man willing to fly to Kinshasa and make a deal with a dictator and get the two best heavyweights in the world to trust him without asking too many questions. That took a specific kind of nerve and a specific kind of intelligence that most people in boxing in 1974 did not have. But the fighters who trusted him without asking too many questions paid for that trust with their money, repeatedly, across decades. He is 93 years old now. A $3 billion fraud lawsuit was filed against him in January 2025, alleging that he encouraged a promoter named Cecil Miller to spend years and substantial resources organizing a 50th anniversary commemoration of the Rumble in the Jungle in Nigeria, then sent a cease and desist letter claiming no knowledge of the project when it was days from going public. In its specifics, it was a new story. In its shape, it was the oldest story in his career. Don King built the biggest events in the history of boxing, and he extracted the maximum from everyone around him at every stage of building them. He served less than 4 years for stomping a man to death on a Cleveland sidewalk. He parlayed a pardon from the governor and a press box full of reporters who loved the spectacle too much to focus on what was underneath it into one of the longest and most profitable careers in sports promotion history. His fighters made him wealthy. In return, many of them left his orbit with a fraction of what they should have had. Sam Garrett's last words, reportedly spoken to the man who was kicking him in the head. "I'll give you the money, Don." In one form or another, that sentence was spoken by almost everyone who ever had a contract with Don King.